Thank you for joining us today. We'll begin in a few minutes. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I'm the Assistant Director at Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for our travel talk, The River Elbe, Microcosm of European History, presented by Professor Werner Sollers. Before I turn things over to our distinguished speaker, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom webinar. For the duration of your lecture, your video and microphone will be turned off so we can direct our attention to our speaker. On the bottom of your screen, you will see several buttons to interact with. Please insert your questions in the Q&A box. You will also see a chat box, which is intended for comments, sharing information, and to engage with fellow alumni. To chat the entire audience, please select all panelists and attendees when submitting your comment. For those of you who would like to hide this chat feature, you may do so by moving the chat feed to the side of your screen. Closed captioning is available, and you will find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, please message our support team by selecting HAA support in the chat. Please note today's 1-hour webinar will be recorded and shared with you. Finally, we appreciate your patience should we experience technological glitches or delays due to the nature of our virtual environment. Please be aware that you can adjust your own sound preferences on your personal device. In the spirit of travel, I'd like to kick things off by encouraging you to share your location in the chat box so we can see where we're all tuning in from. Let's take a look. Great, thank you. Well, please keep it coming. I am so thrilled to pass this over to Professor Sollers, but first, a brief word about our speaker. Werner Sollers is the Henry B. and Anne M. Cabot Professor of English Emeritus. He joined the Harvard faculty in 1983 and taught for more than 3 decades. Professor Sollers has also taught at universities around the world: Berlin, Oxford, Paris, Jerusalem, and Abu Dhabi, just to name a few. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and the Academia Europaea, Werner is the author of several books. Together with his spouse, Alide, he is currently at work on the book Face to Face with Antiquity, which is about travelers visiting ancient sites. Werner, I am so delighted to have you with us today, all the way from Venice. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I would love to pass the mic over to you. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Susanna Lansing, for inviting me to give this talk, and Piper Chapman for this wonderful introduction, and also for playing Smetana right at the beginning. So we have the Moldau theme going before I will be able to get to the first slide. So let me go to the PowerPoint. Oh, this wasn't it. Okay. Sorry, I have to get back to this. Oh my God. It's bad. Here we are. Just one wrong click. I hope you're all well and eager to travel again after some time that stopped us from doing it. And I want to give us the illusion that we're going down the Elbe together today, whether it's morning for you or afternoon or evening as it is for me. So the River Elbe, a microcosm for European history. The river flows very gently for much of the way. A boat ride is as smooth as on a quiet lake. You see much green, left and right, sheep and cows. There are mountains, vineyards, but also long stretches of flatland. In our stories today of kings and bridges, of writing and different visual styles, of creation and of destructive wars, we'll imagine moving downstream from Prague to Magdeburg. Hence, we'll not proceed chronologically, but go back and forth in time along the way. The Elbe, or Labe, as it is called in Czech, is 680 miles long. With its subsidiary rivers, its drainage basin takes an area as large as Montana, and there are about 25 million people who live in this drainage area of the River Elbe. The Vltava, or Moldau, and that was the Smetana piece that you just heard, was about the River Moldau, has the two arms here at Melnik coming together with the Elbe, which is on the left. And you can clearly see there's more water coming from the Moldau than from the Elbe. So this raises the question for which I've never found a good answer. Why is the whole river not called Moldau? So the bigger river goes into the smaller river and takes on the name of the smaller river. Now from Melnik on, the descent of the river is very steep for the first stretch, but then from Dresden on, it is much, much gentler. You have the rate on the slide. It's 85 meters for over 500 kilometers. So that's a lot of meandering, slow moving river afterwards. The Elbe was called Albis Flumen by the Romans. Tacitus said that one hears very little about it, but it was outside of the Roman domain. On the map, you see this L-shaped thing cutting across Europe. That's the River Rhine and the River Danube, and they marked the boundary of the Roman Empire. So along the Elbe, you will not find any Roman ruins. Later on, the Elbe served as a while as eastern border of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, a settlement between castles is first mentioned in 928. By Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, however, we get the first reference to the name Prague. He calls it Fracha. He was a traveler from Cordoba in Muslim Andalusia, and he was the one who first mentioned the name Prague in a document in the year 965. He was, by the way, on his way to Magdeburg, which was the older settlement and also the place where the King Otto, who was the first real Holy Roman Emperor, resided every now and then. He writes furthermore, as Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, that there were Russians and Slavs who come there from Krakow, they're Muslims, Jews, Turks from the country of Turks and bring goods. So we have the sense of a small trading hub already in place. But the figure who really put Prague on the map as the big city that it became was Charles IV. He left a very strong imprint on Prague. He built the new town, began when he was still only prince, the construction of St. Vitus's cathedral. St. Vitus is the patron saint of Prague, as well as a stone bridge that now carries his name. The architect of both was the famous Peter Parler. He made Prague a center of trade routes that we had seen. It was already 400 years earlier, but he yielded liberties to merchants, and that resulted in an influx of foreigners coming to Prague. And he guaranteed the safety of the roads, a big thing in medieval travel. He became king in 1346, then was crowned a second time in Aachen, which was a nod toward Charlemagne and toward the whole putative origins of the Holy Roman Empire. And in 1355, he became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The bridge tower, oh, by the way, you see him on this monument from the 19th century holding something in his hand that we will get to in a second. But the bridge tower was built between 1370 and 80, and you see on the right the statues of Saint Vitus in the center, the patron saint, and then Charles IV as emperor and Václav IV as kings decorating the bridge. On the other side, on the left, it's the back side of the same bridge tower, you see the coat of arms of Prague, about which we will talk a little bit later on. And this is what he was holding in his hand. It's the golden bull, which was the seal for a document that formalized the system of electing emperors. They had to be elected unanimously by 7 prince electors. 3 of these were bishops and 4 were secular rulers. And 3 of those 4 secular rulers came from the lands on the Elbe, from Bohemia, Saxony, and Brandenburg. So you can see what a strong power block that was. Charles made the Moldau navigable. He regularized court proceedings and founded the first North European university in 1348. The earliest European university was Bologna. Charles wrote an autobiography in Latin, ab ipso conscripto, written by himself, and the book has lots of themes in it. He meditates on what is true Christian life. He offers advice to rulers. He interprets the parables in Matthew's gospel, but 8 chapters are truly autobiographical, written in the first person, and sometimes he writes first person singular and sometimes first person plural. In one section that you have in front of you here, he describes his return to Prague. He finds out that his mother had died, his brother and sisters were elsewhere, and so he describes his loneliness, without father or mother, brother or sister, without anyone that he knew. See that at the end of the first paragraph, nec patrem, nec matrem, nec fratrem, nec sorores, nec aliquem notum. That's the situation in which he finds himself. But he even forgot the Bohemian language, so he was all alone and he couldn't communicate. But now he adds that with God's grace, he relearned it quickly and is able now to write and speak it, as well as French, Italian, German, and Latin. A Prague architecture with its medieval gabled towers seemed to embody ancient secrets, and one could call that the Prague visual style #1. And this Prague look inspired expressionist filmmakers, and it is no wonder that the myth of the golem originated in Prague, that of an artificial man who was formed out of clay taken from the river Moldau. Judah Löw ben Bezalel, the rabbi of the Altneuschule synagogue, one of the oldest in Europe, supposedly created this golem in its attic. And Rabbi Löw died in 1609, and he is buried at the Prague Old Jewish Cemetery. Few visitors are likely to forget the clock with Hebrew numerals that runs counterclockwise on the Jewish City Hall, or the intricate astronomical clock on Prague City Hall. In the modern period, Franz Kafka embodies well the spirit of the city, about which he commented, "Prague doesn't let go. This little mother has claws. One has to give in or else." And one of Kafka's sketches is devoted to Prague's city coat of arms, the one that you saw very vaguely on the tower to the bridge. And Kafka casts Prague as if it were the city of Babel with a tower doomed to go under. All the legends and songs that came to birth in that city are filled with longing for a prophesied day when the city would be destroyed by 5 successive blows from a gigantic fist. It is for this reason, too, that the city has a closed fist on its coat of arms, and you see it on these various images below. Now, Kafka also willfully misread the Statue of Liberty in his novel America from 1913. He writes about the statue, her arm with a sword stretched upward as though newly raised aloft, and the free breezes wafted around her. So the Statue of Liberty with a sword, did Kafka superimpose the Prague coat of arms onto the Statue of Liberty? He had never been to America. Kafka has become a cult figure in today's Prague. We've already seen Kafka street signs, monuments, cafes, and t-shirts, and one also sees tattoos with Kafka's angular drawings. Yet Kafka's writing was banned by Czech and East German authorities, so pretty much in our entire Elbe territory during the entire period of the Cold War. Only a Kafka Congress that the scholar Edgar Goldstücker convened in a villa at the confluence of the Elbe and the Moldau in 1963 changed the tide. Their dissident voices came to the fore that helped to usher in the Prague Spring of 1968, the moment of hope that was violently crushed by Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces. Goldstücker, who had already fled to England after the Munich Agreement of 1938 and had been subjected to a Stalinist show trial, sentenced to death at first, then to life, but finally released in 1955, now had to flee another time, returning only in 1989 when the Velvet Revolution ended communist rule. Now, this leads us to some dates. The 20th century was a particularly dramatic century in an area that had a very quiet first millennium, but then things accelerated in the second millennium and came to a real high point in the 20th century. So you look at the dates that were most important for Bohemia and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. You see that in 1918, the empires ended, Habsburg was dissolved, and the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia was created. 1938 was the famous Munich Agreement, where with the consent of the French and the British, Czechoslovakia had to yield territories, mainly to Germany, but also to Hungary and to Poland. 1939, the beginning of World War II, 1941, also the setting in of the Holocaust. Then 1945 to 1949, a population reshuffling in Central Europe. And in 1948, a communist coup in Czechoslovakia. In 1949, establishment of a communist regime in East Germany, so that our whole Elbe territory, starting in 1949, is communist. 1968 is the moment of hope with Alexander Dubček and the hope for a Prague Spring, leading for a form of democratic socialism that gets squashed. And then in 1989, the Velvet Revolution, and you have a photograph of Václav Havel, who was a prime promoter of the Velvet Revolution, a playwright, become a politician, and you see him together with Josef Jářab, who was instrumental for the Velvet Revolution in Moravia, and who also came to one earlier Harvard alumni trip along the Elbe and talked about the Velvet Revolution. I must mention at least one more Prague visual style after the medieval mystical and the Kafka look that I bet all of you will recognize. I mean Alphonse Mucha's Art Nouveau posters and commercial art. Mucha, who lived from 1860 to 1939, often used pastel colors in a symmetrical arrangement. A beautiful woman's face decorated with flowers at the center, most famously Sarah Bernard, and surrounded by a circle or semicircle with decorations or inscriptions. Working in Paris, Mucha added Art Nouveau's distinctive curvy lines, ostensibly made by the model's hair or by a flower stem, but in reality designed only to create that recognizable Art Nouveau Mucha effect. And it was an effect that lent itself to advertising. You've probably all seen one of these posters. Mucha even advertised on the left his own art show with such posters. But as you see, champagne, he also did perfume ads and so forth. He returned to Bohemia in 1910 and devoted himself to a series of huge, these are 6 by 8 meter, huge historical paintings. Among them, the one that I'm showing you now, it is Jan Hus preaching in the Bethlehem Chapel. Now, Jan Hus had been a rector of Prague University, founded by Charles IV, and became a precursor of the Protestant Reformation because he challenged church authority in Bohemia. The place is called Bethlehem Chapel because it couldn't be called church, but it's a vast chapel. And he opposed the church's authority. He preached in the Czech vernacular, and he particularly was opposed to indulgences, that was paying money to priests in order to get absolution for sins. Thus, but he was, of course, ostracized and excommunicated by the church and burned at the stake in 1415 for heresy. But his followers remained active, and that you see in the next slide. On June 16, 1426, so more than a decade after he had been killed by the church, close to the Elbe at Aussich or Usti nad Labem, there was a battle between Hussites and a crusader army, and using circle wagons, the Hussites prevailed. So they defeated a big crusader army of knights. Now, our next stop is in Bohemian and Saxon Switzerland. The Elbe flows in this map, the geological map. You see it diagonally through from the, you see Melnik again on the lower right to Dresden on the upper left. And the river now runs through a very strange landscape, partly wooded, rocky, in which dramatically different levels of table mountains like buttes, irregular fissured palisadic structures, and level plateaus alternate with deep crags, valleys, or canyon-style gorges. And all of this gives the area its distinctive quality. The sandstone mountains here come from the Cretaceous period, millions of years ago, and consist of horizontal layers of petrified sand. The sandstone has been used for the construction and reconstruction of Dresden. It's been cut and traversed by the Elbe and its tributaries, as it reached this boundary on its way north. The landscape north of the mountains formed after the Ice Age in Europe, when the glaciers melted and large riverbeds were created out of glacial valleys, of which the northern part of the Elbe is one. The area is popular among hikers. There are many trails, and at the Bastei, which you will see in a second, there is also a famous walk bridge that the camera will take us right above the mountain crest, and you will see the bridge, which became a popular pedestrian walkway for people taking hikes in the mountains. The rivers still work the sandstone every day, and one can tell that from the red color of the sandy water of the Elbe after that. This clip came from a film called The Elbe von Oben, a documentary that I highly recommend. You can download the whole thing online. One of these table mountains is Königstein, which was also a fortress. And I go ahead now and say the inventor or reinventor in Europe of porcelain was imprisoned there for a while so that he would be able to come up with a formula. Bernardo Bellotto painted Königstein repeatedly and from different angles. At the moment in London, you can see 4 of his different paintings, and there's a wonderful curator's talk about Bellotto at Königstein online at the National Gallery in London. This is Veduta style painting. He worked with a one-hole camera, and every detail matters. You see the Lilienstein table rock in the back, and art, was the theory, should reflect nature with accuracy. You may also notice the figures in the foreground. These are called Rückenfiguren. The woman who is lying here is showing us her back because they draw us into the painting. And on the right, you see that Bellotto had fun with the Rückenfigur because he even took the back of a cow as a back figure. Caspar David Friedrich, our next artist, saw a different Elbe and different Elbe mountains. He wanted to express what he felt in confrontation with nature. It wasn't a matter of representing it with precisionist accuracy. 2/3 of the painting are bluish sky, clouds and haze. The ship is in the haze too, against which the green foreground forms a contrast. A natural rock gate with 2 tiny human figures that you can just make out at the bottom of the picture. The bulk of this pencil drawing is taken up by the rocks that are painted over with brown brush strokes and seem to be oppressing these tiny figures walking through them. So here nature seems something very grand. In a rocky gorge, he bases this painting in part on a stretch of the mountains we've just seen, but he exaggerates the depth between the crags. So again, it's not a matter of faithful representation, but his mood called for the crags to be deeper than they actually were. And Friedrich's most famous painting, Wanderer Over a Sea of Fog, shows the prominent back figure. You can't not look at it because it also is at the center of the vanishing point of the painting. So all the perspectival lines lead into it. And we see nature again as a projection of feelings. The landscape consists of parts that Friedrich had drawn here and there, but their assemblage is totally imaginary. But what is the feeling to be projected? Is it general melancholy? Is it a specific mourning for a friend who had died? Or is it perhaps elation that's seeming to be above the clouds? Or a romantic manifesto? The river flattens after the Sandstein Mountains and moves more slowly as we approach the unmistakable panorama of Dresden. Dresden is a latecomer on the river. It was mentioned for the first time only in 1216. It was a Slavic name for what is now called Neustadt on the right bank of the river for marshy settlement, but it took shape under Augustus the Strong in the late 17th and early 18th century. And Augustus's image is everywhere in Dresden. He benefited from personal union in Poland where he became king and had to convert to Catholicism, but he let his populace and his wife remain Protestant. He decided to build up Dresden as an architectural metropolis, as well as a mecca for all the arts. The city had escaped destruction in the 30 Years' War, but had experienced a fire in 1685. So this offered the opportunity for a plan to create a whole cultural city of remarkable Baroque buildings, hospitable to all the arts. Earlier Saxon dukes had already shown an interest in arts and music, and Heinrich Schütz, for example, was court composer before Augustus. But in 1711, a building boom started under Augustus, fed by the sandstone quarries from the mountains we have just seen. Purpelmann finished the Zwinger, that was also housed the porcelain collection of Augustus, about which more soon. And Georg Beer built the Frauenkirche. Balthasar Perlmoser produced sculptures en masse that are decorative all over Dresden. And in 1738, Gaetano Chiaveri begins the Hofkirche. This is now already after Augustus's time, because his one legitimate son and his grandson continued to see the plan through. When George Ticknor, who pioneered teaching modern languages at Harvard, visited Dresden in 1835, he was gushing with praise in his diary about a city of the size of Berlin with 3 or 4 palaces, 2 grand churches, a library of 300,000 volumes, a collection of about 200,000 engravings, the most valuable and curious cabinet of porcelain in Europe, the finest single gallery of pictures in Europe, all accessible on the easiest terms to strangers. Add to this that the streets of Dresden are as clean and nice as possible, the public walks fine and numerous, and the drives in the environs on both sides of the Elbe beautiful, that the theater, both in opera and in tragedy and comedy, is excellent. He concludes that for its size, no city in the world now can be compared to Dresden in whatever relates to intellectual culture and arts. Augustus and his successors left behind a new Baroque capital that included the magnificently enlarged Augustus Bridge. Called Florence on the Elbe by Herder, Dresden also modeled itself on Venice, and the bridge was intended to be a rival to the Rialto Bridge. The painter who strengthened the Venetian impression of the city was Bernardo Bellotto, whom we encountered before at Königstein, and who took on and signed his paintings Canaletto, the name of his famous uncle from whom he had learned his trade. His huge Veduta paintings show the glamour of the newly recreated city. Bellotto came to Dresden at age 26, young man, and he produced the Veduta that you have been looking at, called Dresden from the right bank of the Elbe above Augustus Bridge. Bellotto's famous technique here yields an accurate and pleasing image of the city in the bend of the river. Note the sand from the Saxon Swiss mountains on the right bank that the figures are standing on. Now, Bellotto also made smaller sized replicas of his paintings, one of which is in the National Gallery of Ireland. And there are a whole number of differences. One concerns Bellotto's own presence in the original painting among the small figures in the left front. Whoops, we went too far. Here we are. That's the close-up, and you see there's the second figure from the left on the original painting below is Bellotto himself. He is standing between 2 court painters, and he painted himself into the company of court painters, of opera singers, entertainers, of the cultural entourage of the Augustan rule. And we can look at this as a job application, and he did get the job and did become court painter. And as his biographer writes, he received 4 times the salary of the court painters that he's painted himself in between. Bellotto repeatedly included the Frauenkirche in his views. A painting from 1749 shows the arrival of Augustus III on the Neumarkt on a splendid coach pulled by 6 white horses. And one almost has to pay attention to the small figures in Bellotto's work too. So this is not only a city portrait, it is also an homage to Augustus III. His work was also adapted to copper engravings, giving it a wider circulation. The Frauenkirche, as a large Protestant church newly built by Georg Beer, became a central symbol for Dresden. The total destruction of the church in the bombing of February 1945 left only ruined fragments. After unification, its reconstruction was planned immediately and then carried out with donations from Britain too. In Dresden, there had been collection of money for Coventry, and now citizens of Coventry donated money for Dresden, and also the Crown of England contributed to the reconstruction of the church. And I want to show you a few pictures now of the reconstructed church that was very carefully done on the basis of the old architectural drawings and photography. And here you see another just a photograph taken from that film, the Elbe von oben, the Elbe from above. Pöppelmann's Zwinger, which houses the porcelain collection of Augustus, had already been restored in 1964 and only needed a new facelift, but is one of the places that still resembles how Bellotto saw them. Now we're moving to Meissen and to the porcelain territory of the Elbe. Now, originally, Johann Friedrich Böttger was an alchemist, and he was searching for gold. And he almost drained the budget of Augustus by getting more and more supplies that he needed in order to find that gold, but it never amounted to anything. And then came the idea of searching for porcelain. After Marco Polo had been to China, there was knowledge of the existence of porcelain, but Europeans weren't able to produce it. And so Böttger finally in 1709 came up with that formula. Augustus had to put him into Königstein, that prison that you saw on the Table Mountain top, to make sure that he would come up with that formula, and he did. And so he was able to produce white porcelain, and then his successors made a prosperous business out of it. The blue lining that was one of the difficult things to arrive at, and that became a Meissen trademark, the sign of the crossed swords always as the trademark of it, the onion pattern set as the most famous of it, and then the statues. Originally, it wasn't that you would use the porcelain so much, but you would have statues or statuettes. Here, the exotic motif, or here, the Rococo motif of shepherds making out in wonderful, colorful porcelain stuff. But as you saw on the lower right here, Meissen also in the 20th century employed famous artists to produce pieces that you can now still see on the Meissen website. Originally, it was just a very, very wealthy product, very expensive product, only for the courts of Europe, and became in the 19th century then this more general thing that we associate with tableware that everybody wanted. Very close to Meissen are two places where the US Army crossed the Elbe in April 1945, constructing pontoon bridges that were given rulers' names, just like we had seen the Charles Bridge and the Augustus Bridge. Here is a Truman Bridge on April 15th, 1945. So at that spot, which was in Barbie, the soldiers already knew that Roosevelt had died on April 12th. But here is a Stalin Bridge. It's called Roosevelt-Stalin Bridge in Torgau, supposedly from the 30th of April, where obviously the news had not yet arrived that Roosevelt was dead. Eisenhower, by the way, stopped with the army on the Elbe-Moldau line, although there had been several crossings of the US Army and they were ready to move ahead, also move across the Moldau and liberate Prague, but they were ordered to stop. Our next stop is the Luther city, Wittenberg, the nucleus of the Protestant Reformation. And we see here a painting that is in the Harvard Art Museums, very late in Luther's life, done by Lukas Kranach, who was a friend and also the main publicist for Luther, who created the look of the Reformation that was very important for its dissemination. The Bible that Luther translated into vernacular, again, like we saw with Jan Hus, it was important to get layman access to the Bible, and you can do that with translated Bibles. They don't have to be in Latin and Greek and Hebrew, but they can be in German, or as Hus was saying, in Czech. You see a statue of Martin Luther in front of the entrance to the church where he posted his 95 theses. They're very redundant. They're all synonyms of each other. It seems to be in Latin and more or less attack the Pope in so many ways that he cannot remit penalties. He doesn't have the right to take money for indulgences. The church should not be in the money business. And if there is so much money in the church, why don't they build St. Peter themselves instead of taking the money from poor parishioners who pay for the absolution? Unbridled preaching of pardons. That is what he says over and over in these theses. But the look also was created by, and that is an effect of the invention of the printing press. You could now have Luther's Bible circulating widely because it could be printed. And also you could have pamphlets in which the point could be made to people who could not read yet, but who could very well get the sense of a sarcastic cartoon that shows the devil on the side of the Pope, and of course the weight going down on the side of Christ giving forgiveness and not the Pope, and the Pope only cashing in another cartoon. The next cartoon on the left is by Lukas Kranach, who also provided that part of the look. The devil is the Pope, and on the right, the answer from the Catholic Church, Luther is the devil. So you have the perfect symmetry in the charge. One point of the contention, of course, was also the celibacy of priests. So here's a pamphlet, a pro-Reformation pamphlet that says what is so bad about priests getting married. And you see also some nuns in the background. And now Luther marrying a nun, Katharina von Bora, and that marriage, highly heretical in the eyes of the church, painted by Kranach over and over, so that every Protestant church that wanted a double image of Luther and of von Bora could get paintings of that couple. Cranach also, and when I say Cranach, it always means Cranach the elder and the younger and his entire workshop. So Cranach also painted other reformers, Melanchthon, who was also a Wittenberg resident, more reformers, and also dukes who had been supportive of the Reformation. So Cranach, as a painter, became a central propagandist for the Reformation. Here he did even an altar where on the bottom, I enlarged it on the lower right, you see Luther praying from a pulpit next to the crucifixion of Christ. This was the factory where the Cranachs operated. One can even think of, I was thinking of Andy Warhol's factory. So you had the school producing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings supporting the Reformation. This was the University of Wittenberg, the quadrangle of it, where Luther and also Melanchthon had studied. And there's a little plaque that I noticed that was to the first African PhD recipient, Anton Wilhelm Amo, who got the PhD in 1734 with a Latin dissertation in philosophy. Now we have one more stop before the last, and this is Dessau. You see the Bauhaus, an art colony in the Weimar years, closed down by the Nazis at the end, that explored a new look, a modernist look in all the arts and crafts. So we have architecture, interior architecture. On the right is a photograph of a weaving class, and photography also became an art form. Painting, of course, Oskar Schlemmer, this a very famous painting that is now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And the Museum of Modern Art, whose director had been at the Bauhaus a couple of times, was inspired by the Bauhaus to imagine the Museum of Modern Art. You see also a model sitting with a Schlemmer mask in a Breuer chair. So you have the interior design, you have household items, an ashtray, and a picture coming from the workshop of Brandt, and a photograph, an art photograph of these objects taken by Lucia Moholy-Nagy. The last photograph from the Bauhaus segment is one where the negative is in the Harvard Art Museum by Lionel Feininger, docks on the River Elbe. He liked to play with the light and dark, the shadow and the brightness of the river and the blackness of the branches and the docks. And he took this photograph when he was at the Bauhaus, but he too had to emigrate in the early 1930s and went to the United States. And now we have reached our last stop, but it is actually the oldest city on the trip. I mentioned at the beginning that Magdeburg was founded by Charlemagne in 805. So this is the first, already in the 9th century, a mention and a settlement. It became an important city under Otto I, who was the first true Holy Roman Emperor, crowned as such. And you see Magdeburg Cathedral, the first German Gothic cathedral. His statue is right over the entrance doors. I enlarged it a little bit and put it in the middle between these two images of the church. And Otto I also was the one, the emperor to whom that Ibrahim ibn Yaqub went on his way from Prague. So this was already a seat of renown. Unfortunately, Magdeburg had a terrible history afterwards. In the 30 Years' War, Tilly's troops completely sacked and burned and pilfered it so that only a few hundred survivors remained, and the entire city was leveled. I'm not going to show you any images, but Brandenburg was leveled a second time during a massive bombing in January of 1945. But inside the cathedral is an interesting statue. It is a statue of Saint Moritz, or Moritz, who is also the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire and the patron saint of the church. It's the Cathedral of St. Maurice and St. Catherine. And this statue from 1240 to 1250 is the first statue that imagines St. Maurice as a Black figure, which then became a prevalent thing exactly in that Elbe area and remained popular until the 16th century. And you see on the right that Cranach too did a contribution now in the Metropolitan Museum of New York of a Black St. Maurice. The very last thing I want to show you is I was looking for inward texts that give you a feeling of being in Magdeburg. And I think this is an interesting one from the 13th century. A woman who did not become a nun, she became a beguine. You didn't have to do vows. You didn't have to be in a monastery, although she did go to a monastery. And she had proto-Protestant visions. She was getting into direct contact with the Holy Spirit. A priest got her there who had not been ordained. She said he had been ordained in his mother's womb by the Holy Spirit. Now that's not a church ordainment. But she has this vision that the wafer turns into the lamb, and she no longer sees the wafer, but rather a bleeding lamb hanging on a red cross. It looked upon us with such sweet eyes that I shall never be able to forget it. And the passage ends, the translation did not include that in the original. The woman to whom this happened is dead and gone. Is she referring to herself as getting reborn through this vision? But she says, God help that we may yet see her in the company of angels. Amen. Well, here our imaginary trip ends with our initial slide of Ernst Barlach's evening walk by the Elbe River. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Warner. You've taken us through a fabulous journey through the Elbe, and you've provided just such beautiful imagery to go with your presentation. So thank you so much. I would love to begin the Q&A portion of our program. I invite you to send all of your questions to the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as possible. So I'd like to start with a question posed by one of our viewers today, Warner. Has the stretch of the Elbe in Germany changed much since the reunification of Germany after the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Yes, quite a bit. 100 kilometers of the Elbe served as the boundary between East and West Germany. And so at a time when the boundary was heavily guarded, militarily protected, this was a very difficult area to have any kind of amusement trips on. You could probably get some freight barges through with the right papers. So what changed simply is that the connection from Prague to Hamburg was possible again, that simply had been disrupted. Also, of course, there's been quite a bit of structuring along the Elbe to prevent flooding, because the river meanders in this lower part. Flooding is actually part of the whole system. There's marshy land around it, but of course you don't want cities to flood. And there have been throughout history some pretty terrible floods in the Elbe. And now there was one very big one in 2002. So more flood mechanism was built up, so that the last heavy rainfalls of this year, for example, didn't really lead to alarm, but the protective devices seemed to work.
Thank you. In 2014, you traveled on the Harvard Alumni Travels Elbe River Cruise as our study leader. And I wonder if you can share with our group maybe one or two of your favorite ports and why.
Well, I think I've already picked some of the favorite ports for the talk that I've given. These were all wonderful stops and wonderful places to see. I hope that future trips will be able to stop at the Bauhaus. That I think is a fascinating place. There's a good substitute, which is a Bauhaus museum in Berlin, where the trip ends and you can get a feeling of what the Bauhaus was like. I also like the first stretch of the, just when the Moldau becomes Elbe, it still is so mysterious that the big side river shouldn't carry the name forward. But anyway, there I think you have the city of Aussicht or Usti nad Labem, which already has the mountain setting that then we looked at more on the Saxon side. And of course, going to Dresden has to be everybody's favorite spot. So our hikes in the Saxon mountains were also really great. That's what made me, I was about Saxon Switzerland, sounds like a metaphor, but they were really actually good hikes to take, and the paths are perfect. And you don't have to be a mountaineer or chained, or you don't even need sticks. You can just hike around there. So that was another favorite.
Thank you. That sounds wonderful. And you briefly touched upon flooding earlier, and we did get a question from one of our viewers. How has the Elbe fared during the recent excessive rainfall in Europe?
Yeah, no, that I think in this year there were two warnings. One I think was in February, the other one in the summer, I want to say July. But the flooding that took such a terrible toll of 180 people dying at the Ahr in West Germany didn't have a disastrous effect this time. The 2002 flooding was very serious. There were also some deaths, or not as many, but quite a bit of destruction. And that led, I think, to quite a bit fixing up of the structure.
And actually, kind of to expand on this question, we just received a question. Are there notable effects of climate change on the river and its drainage area? Do you happen to have a response to that?
Well, everybody talks about climate change with everything, but specifically about the Elbe. I mean, I think in general, the temperature is getting warmer. So I guess it must lead to some more evaporation, I would imagine, but I don't know. I haven't read up particularly on that issue concerning the Elbe. Certainly all of Germany is in arms. All three parties in the election the coming Sunday have their, part of their program is to do something about climate change, reduce fossil fuels and so forth. But I have not, I don't think I can answer that with any knowledge of
Sure.
what it does to the Elbe area.
Thank you. And we want to read this next question. So one of our viewers said, "Thank you so much for this talk, Professor Solers. So many architectural treasures were destroyed in World War II. How were decisions made on what to rebuild?"
That's a very good question. I think, in Dresden, you see very clearly it was the Augustan Dresden that was reconstructed after unification. Before that, the Zwinger was reconstructed, but then large areas of the old city too were just built up in some fashion. Magdeburg is the real loser. I think that's a mystery to me. It was such a jewel of a city, even after it had been destroyed in the 17th century. And it is the oldest city, and historically, to have the oldest Gothic cathedral. Well, the cathedral was reconstructed and done very well, but it's now almost like in an island of green. When we went there, it's quite disheveling to go to the old part of Magdeburg. And then there are lots of buildings, even now, and the building goes on, but without much of an idea of a design. So I think sometimes it's, you have private donors who push, like the castle in Berlin is a good example. And I think the Frauenkirche was also such an example that became the symbol. We want to have the Baroque Dresden back, but then the money never is enough to do the whole thing. So, what gets selected and what gets left out. I think Dresden is selected, Magdeburg is left out. I mean, so those things that just happen, I think. And I don't really know in each case, what led to the decision. No, we don't really need to go there, or this we can leave. The synagogue, for example, in Dresden was replaced by a very modern building. I had a slide of that too in the show, but I had to reduce it a bit, not to reconstruct the historical synagogue.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about food. Can you talk to us about the food and how it has potentially evolved from influences over time?
Well, I mean, you have kind of, I think, a fairly similar fare from along the Elbe from Prague. I mean, it's famous for these knödel, you know, the dumplings and thick sauces. I think that, it's still very much meat and tomato and potato based, sort of as the main course. Of course, now you have all kinds of counter cuisines, and there are just as many vegans in Prague as there are in the big cities everywhere else in the world. But so you have every cuisine that you want as well, and Thai restaurants and Vietnamese restaurants. But the local fare, I think, what still gets eaten if you go to the first bar along the way when you step out of a train station, would be the one where you can expect some mix of meat and potatoes. And the river has become, that actually is an interesting thing about the environment, has become more friendly to fish, because there used to be a lot of industrial pollution, and that has been largely cleared. So fish has come back. And in that documentary that I mentioned, the Elbe from Above, there's a stretch of where you can see the fish, but also there are eagles now, there are beavers. It was in fact an area where beavers were regenerating the whole beaver population in Europe. We don't eat beavers, but the fish we do eat. So that's the river fish contribution to the fare, in addition to the meat and potato base of the.
Thank you. Well, for our last question here, I actually wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your upcoming book. You mentioned that you're focusing on ancient sites. What sites are you examining?
Well, we are examining sites like Persepolis in Persia, like Pompeii in Italy, like the reconstruction of a Cretan civilization in Crete, the Minotaur idea that archaeologists brought. And one section also is about an archaeologist by the name of Dörpfeld, who believed that he had found the true Ithaca, that it wasn't actually the island called Ithaca, but it was Lefkadas. And he had a lifelong obsession. He moved there ultimately, wrote several books, and it seemed he was waiting for Penelope there at the end. He died, and he's buried at the very spot where he thought Odysseus had landed after his trip.
Oh, interesting.
People who are often obsessed by the idea of traveling to these sites of antiquity, and whose tales are very interesting to us.
It sounds very interesting, Werner. Congratulations, and we look forward to hearing more. Well, we have run out of time, and so on behalf of the Harvard travel team and our alumni community, I want to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation for your time. For those of you interested in traveling on a Harvard Alumni Travels program, Professor Solers is scheduled to lead a trip next year, Quintessential Peru on Delphin 2, October 17th through the 28th, 2022. We placed a link in the chat, but do reach out to our office with any questions or if you want to get more information. As soon as you close out of the webinar, a brief survey will appear. I'd be grateful if you would take the time to complete this survey. As a reminder, the recording of this lecture will be shared with you. We have a fabulous lineup of fall travel talks, some of which you will see on your screen. We hope you'll join us for more engaging conversations. You can find the registration links for some of these lectures in the chat, and you can also explore more information on our website. Thank you so much again, and take care.
Thank you.